so I have to stay.
Call into order the Tuesday, January 6, 2015 meeting of the Township of South Orange Village Board of Adjustment. May we have a roll call?
Yes, Mr. Don.
Here.
Mr. Descala.
Here.
Mr.
Guess it's
Polipiano.
working now.
Here.
Mr. Reeves.
Here.
Mr. Semper.
Here.
And Mr. Breen.
Here.
Pursuant to Section 5, Chapter 231, PL 1975, this is to state for the record that adequate notice of this meeting has been provided to the public by posting and maintaining the annual notice of regular meetings on the bulletin board in Village Hall, by publishing the annual notice of regular meetings for 2015 in the December 2014 edition of the South Orange Maplewood News Record, and by filing said notice in the office of the village clerk. Okay, so the first order of business tonight is the reorganization of the board itself and the election of officers and appointment of professionals. We do this every year in January. Do we have any nominations for vice chair? I nominate Mr. Bill Don.
I nominate Mr. Bill Don.
That would be a second. Bill, are you interested?
Yes.
Does anybody else want to be nominated? Or does anybody else want to nominate somebody else? Okay, so we have a second, so should we, we should vote on that then?
Mr. Descala.
Yes.
Mr. Polipiano.
Yes.
Mr. Reeves.
Yes.
Mr. Semper.
Yes.
And Mr. Breen.
Yes.
And now for election of chairman. Do you have any nominations?
Mr. Chairman, would you turn the meeting over to Mr. Don, please, at this point?
Oh, that's right.
I don't need it, I have my own.
Okay.
Would you like to be chairman, Mr. Chairman?
I'd enjoy being chairman again.
Okay.
So the floor is open for nominations for
Are we
chairman.
recommending Mr. Bina again? Bina is going to be recommended again?
I guess, am I allowed to nominate anybody yet?
You're allowed to nominate.
I'll nominate Mr. Reeves.
I'd like to second that.
Other nominations? Okay, none seen, then I guess we should vote on Mr. Reeves.
Okay. Mr. Semper.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Polipiano.
Yes.
Mr. Descala.
Yes.
Mr. Breen.
Yes.
And Mr. Don.
Yes.
Okay, so now we move on to the appointment of professionals. So I have first here on the list is the planner. And do we have any discussions about the planner that we'd like to have before we take a nomination, in favor or against any particular planner?
When we say the planner, we talking about the firm that we use
Well,
for
Higher
planning
Gruel
purposes.
is the current planner.
All right, well, the planner sounds like an individual.
It'll be a firm.
All right, good.
Higher Gruel is the current planner, has been for years.
Is there any issue, Higher Gruel is also the planner for the planning board?
Yes.
Right?
Last night, they were appointed for the year.
Yeah, and I do wonder sometimes whether we'd be better, whether there'd be a benefit of having more voices. Or whether, I mean, obviously, by using the same firm for both boards, we're guaranteed consensus, unless they talk out of two sides of the mouth, but we're guaranteed consensus. But, you know, in some cases, variety of opinion is good, right? And you wonder if we're not missing an opportunity in having more voices. You know, I don't know that I'm raising that as I think they do excellent work, and I really value Susan in particular, but I do wonder whether we wouldn't be better off with more voices.
That's interesting because, you know, some towns that I appear in front of, they specifically don't allow it.
That's right, they don't allow it, and
Right.
I think the reason is because there's a kind of check and balance there, right?
They don't allow,
They don't allow the same planner to represent both boards.
really?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're sort of making the rules and advising on the enforcement of the rules, in a sense, right? And again, I think Susan does a great job.
The bending of the rules.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, this board, bends rules, right?
That's right.
So, yeah, advising on the bending of them, not the enforcement of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, much like Mr. Polipiano, I don't have, this isn't really a discussion, isn't a reflection of the
Not
work
at all.
that she does, but it is an interesting thought. I mean, I know that it most towns, at least in Bergen County where I do most of my work, they don't have the same
Yeah,
planner.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's also, frankly, it's also helpful sometimes when questions come up about the master plan, and Susan obviously knows it cold, having seemingly written it. But I think it's something we should consider, and maybe it's something we put in our annual letter or something like that as a question about whether the town would be better served by having more voices, more opinions.
Well, in the not-so-distant past, we had an open opportunity for other firms to compete for this role. Was it just a year ago?
I don't understand how that works, because, I mean, doesn't the town hire the planner, and then, I mean,
Actually, the board has,
are we,
the board doesn't have the funds, but provided the funds are granted to the board has the authority to hire its planner.
So there's a fixed budget for planner, and
Correct.
our choice is how to
The
spend
choice
that
is the
budget.
board's choice.
got it.
So if you wanted to follow this up, you know, I understand your point, but if you wanted to follow this up, it would need to be for next year.
That's right,
You'd
that's
have to-
right.
We'd need to look into, if you had a particular planner in mind that you thought was really good, you'd, what, I'm getting a shaking of the head.
Just two things. Regarding the use of the planner and the planning board, the planner's role for this board is basically what the town's perspective is from the town's planning perspective is when it comes to applications. And then the board obviously has the option of making decisions to grant waivers, or bend the rules, as you might say. So I think it is a good idea to keep some of that consistency. I know what you're saying about having different planners and, towns having different planners, but, and then the other side of the coin is if the board wanted to get a different planner, then I believe the board would have to put out a public RFP.
Yeah.
To do that. It wouldn't be a matter of just if somebody knows a planner.
Right.
Obviously they could direct someone to respond to the RFP,
Right.
but that would have to be done in the
Right.
public RFP process.
That was actually a question that I was going to follow up with was, how do we sometimes go through a process and other times not? That's a little confusing, we,
Right, well, the board, public bodies have the ability to hire professionals without public bids.
yeah.
The public contract law allows boards to hire professionals for up to 1 year, no longer, without the public bidding process. So the board has the authority to do that. Boards do hire or write up RFPs and publish them whenever they have an idea that they might want to consider others who might want to serve.
Okay. It's like an at-will kind of thing then.
Right.
Any other further discussion? Okay, maybe we have a nomination for a planner?
I'll nominate Hire Gruhl to represent the zoning board.
I'll second that.
Okay, Mr. Don,
Yes,
Mrs. DeScalo,
Yes.
Mr. Parlapiano,
Yes.
Mr. Reeves.
Yes.
Mr. Semper,
Yes.
and Mr. Breen.
Yes.
Okay, and we move on next to the attorney. Do you have to walk off the stage, Patrick?
I will if you want me to.
No, I don't want you to walk off the stage.
You don't want to
do you?
surprise you.
Okay.
Why? Does it,
I don't know why he would have to walk off the stage.
why would he, why would you, why, yeah.
Well, he made me hand it over to Bill Don,
You were the chair.
because
Well,
I
you're the
was,
chair, though.
because I was the chair.
So, are you representing Omlin Engineering in some capacity, or?
no, we're doing attorney now. not-
We're doing
Oh,
attorney.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
I'm an attorney.
Yeah, He can't
So-
vote, so.
Mr. Dwyer is our attorney, and I think he's done an excellent job for a number of years. He's also the planning board attorney. The resolutions hit the sweet spot of comprehensiveness, but also relative conciseness. He's been open to our suggestions about when he puts out his first draft, if things need improvement, doesn't show that pride where he, won't modify things, and as a result, the resolutions end up being better. I know offline, I enjoy working with Mr. Dwyer, responds to the calls that you all never hear about, that are involved in just the background, normal bureaucratic business of the board. So I will go ahead and nominate Mr. Dwyer, but if y'all want to have any further discussion, you can. But the nomination at least is out there, and maybe sometime in a moment or two, somebody will second it.
I second Mr. Dwyer.
Well, just before we go to a vote, I'll just add in that I think we'd be hard pressed to find an attorney that would be a good replacement for Mr. Dwyer. He's well grounded and thoughtful in his commentary in meetings. He's always professional and always courteous, and those are things that we need on the board.
And we didn't ask him one thing. Do you still want to be on the board?
Or do you want to represent the
Okay,
board?
we didn't ask him that.
And I think that I have lived through many attorneys like Rusty, so I am happy seconding this appointment.
Okay, let the record reflect that Mr. Shapiro has arrived. All right, so we have a nomination, or a first motion by me and a second by Mr. Semper. So may we have a roll call? Vote?
Mr. Don,
Yes.
Mr. DeScalo,
Yes.
Mr. Parlapiano,
Yes.
Mr. Reeves,
Yes.
Mr. Semper,
Yes,
and Mr. Breen.
Yes.
All right, so now we move on to the consultant engineer. So this is Omland Engineering. Do we have any discussion about the engineer?
Omlin was also a candidate during the process that when we had an open bid and several firms submitted, and Mr. Don and I we attended those selection meetings and felt that they were the strongest candidate at the time. And since then, I feel that they've represented the town very well. They write excellent reports. They have thoughtful questions and comments during our meetings. I think that we made a good choice with them. And I think it's worth sticking with them.
The only concern I have is I know the firm has been sold,
Yeah.
To,
a big engineering firm. I
Which
don't
one?
know. I don't know.
Bowman Consulting?
What
Bowman Consulting?
Bowman?
Bowman?
I don't know if they're going to continue.
Doesn't
to
necessarily
operate
mean
as
the
a
staff
separate
is going to
entity or what,
change,
but-
right? I've seen a lot of these, buyouts of firms, and often you see the same players through 3 buyouts, and so it's not necessarily a problem.
my only concern about a consulting engineer was, especially in the radio frequency business, I wish with all the towers that were going up, we had someone that could educate us a little better, represent the board a little stronger, because I don't know if that's going to continue with these folks putting up these big, stupid antennas in the town. And and that's my only concern, that the engineers that we have are not, more radio frequency engineers. No, like we had to actually come up with the design of how we wanted the last towers to look and stuff like that. And I believe that should have been an engineering function. So,
Fair enough. I think that Omlin worked with the last applicant between meetings, and they're a large firm, and I guarantee you that they've got an expert in every field. So I suppose if we have a special need, like in this case, we could ask them
Yeah.
to make sure that someone's present representing
sure.
the town that's an expert in the
because we
same.
put a lot of time into telling them how to do the top and stuff like that. I think that, that should have been the job of our consulting engineer.
Well, I think they did, like Mr. DeScala suggested, did work between meetings, but I hear what you're saying, and I think we should try to pay attention. If we really get an obscure engineering question that requires more particular expertise, and we can, we're hiring a firm, and so we can ask them for their true expert in a particular area. It's fair enough consideration.
So,
Any other discussion?
No.
So may we have a motion?
Yeah, I move that we continue with Omlin.
I'll second.
May we have a vote?
Mr. Parlapiano,
Yes.
Mr. Reeves,
Yes.
Mrs. Semper,
Yes.
Mr. Shapiro,
Yes.
Mr. Breen,
Yes.
Mr. Don,
Yes.
and Mrs. DeScalo.
Yes.
Okay, we move on now to the appointment of the board secretary. And Ms. Davis, are you still interested?
Yes.
Okay, good to hear. So I think Ms. Davis has done a fine job. Again, I've worked with her between sessions, and she's always been responsive to me when I've had questions or needed something done. And likewise, I think she's responded well to Mr. Dwyer with the questions we've had, and that's important. And I think she's recently gotten more confidence in making the minutes shorter, and recognizing those don't have to be a transcript. So that's a nice experience there. I think she's done a fine job, and we should reappoint her. Any other discussion?
I would echo those remarks. I think that Jetty is very professional, never pushy, and respectful with, as far as I can tell, with everyone that she does business with. And so in that regard, she's an excellent person for this role.
May we have a motion? I'll move it. Mr. Shapiro makes a motion. We have a second?
Second.
Mr. Semper?
Okay, Mr. Don,
Yes.
Mr. DeScalo,
Yes.
Mr. Polipiano,
Yes.
Mr. Reeves,
Yes.
Mrs. Semper,
Yes.
Mr. Shapiro,
Yes.
and Mr. Breen.
Yes.
So now we move on to the swearing in of the planner, and well, the engineer's not here, so but we would, do we need to appoint, well, we don't appoint our own zoning officer. We have to swear him in, though, right?
It's a good idea to swear him in at the beginning of the year.
Right. And that's why you're here, correct? Okay.
Sal, would you raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the factual testimony you give to this board during the year 2015 will be the whole truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we move on now to the approval of the resolution for the Singular Wireless Tower, 76 South Orange Avenue. Mr. Dwyer submitted this, and I think it was Mr. Shapiro that it was a technical correction that you're a regular member. And other than that, you didn't have any other problem with it. I looked at it also. I didn't see any corrections or revisions that I had to suggest. Did anybody else have anything?
No.
No.
Okay. So then, with that correction of changing the title of Mr. Shapiro, that we accept the resolution as written. That's a motion. Does anybody have a second?
I'll second.
Mrs. DeScalo,
Yes.
Mr. Polipiano,
Yes.
Mr. Reeves,
Yes.
and Mr. Shapiro.
Yes.
And I want to add on that, I think it did show some creativity on our board's part to move the applicant and to, instead of creating higher and higher towers, which would create a race to the top, as it were.
Right.
Sort of simple thinking outside the box, and so that was well done. So we're in the discussion phase of the meeting here before we adjourn. I want to put out a pitch to the public as well as to the board members that we're down 2 members now, so we need 2 new alternate members.
So nothing in process at this point? We should keep soliciting.
We should keep soliciting.
Yeah.
Yes. I've found no one who's yet expressed interest. Contacted Mr. Rosner, who's the chair of the Planning and Zoning Committee for the Board of Trustees, and he's not aware of anybody yet, any candidates. So the word goes out to the public. If you're interested in working on this board, let's hear from you. Somebody who's interested in can be punctual, responsible, regular attendance, does your homework, slightly obsessive but not too obsessive, respects the law. Some creativity is also useful. What other qualities?
And could afford the late nights.
You can stay here till at least 11 once a month. Yes. and hold your tongue, too. All right, so there's the pitch to the citizens of South Orange. We'd like to hear from you, somebody who's interested. I think it's a fun job. Ed, you're the one guy who's been on this longer than I have,
Oh, man,
and I think it's a blast to do this job.
that's why I asked to be reappointed.
It's a lot of fun. All right, any other questions for discussion?
Just for the annual letter, I assume at some point you're sitting down to do the missive of the year. One topic that came up this year that I think we should put in there, but I'm interested in hearing feedback, is something came up during Seton Hall's application, one of the Seton Hall applications, about when is an apartment building and when is it a dorm, and what zoning applies as they buy apartment buildings and turn them into dorms. And, you know, it was my view at the time that a dorm, even if you buy an apartment building, convert it to a dorm, you know, even if it keeps the same number of units, but you put a bunch of unrelated students in there for an academic year, that it changes the use of the building, in that it changes the impact of that building's use on the surrounding area. And that we should be thinking about that in terms of the zoning law. And I seem to remember in that case that the opinion was, no, it's an apartment building, and it doesn't get, it is treated just as an apartment building. I think that's a mistake from a use point of view, and potentially one that's going to grow, given what Seton Hall has done in town, and one that's worth thinking about in terms of the impact of the university on the town.
And interestingly, when a building changes from an apartment building to a dormitory, from a building code point of view.
Lots changes.
Well, it is, and it's a different it's a different use group.
That's right, that's right. And so things like sprinklers and exits, all that change, and yet we treat it as if nothing's changed from the point of view of impact on the community, of the neighborhood.
What do you mean a different use group?
Well, an apartment building is a residential use group, but it's classified in a separate category from a dormitory. If you were to buy, if Seton Hall were to buy a building that's now an apartment building and was to change it to a dormitory, there would be a series of items they'd have to review and potentially have to upgrade
By state law?
by state law. I'm talking building code, not zoning.
Okay.
By UCC.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a little confused also about, I think this is a very good point brought up. When a building in town is converted into a property of Seton Hall, did that become like an extension of the campus? Is Seton Hall then responsible for policing it, or is South Orange responsible for policing it?
I believe Seton Hall has an agreement for police and fire protection with the town.
So
On
the
campus and
campus
elsewhere.
police then?
No.
Isn't that true, Sal?
I'm not aware of any agreements like that.
I know the fire department certainly services the campus.
Well, yes, they do provide.
So you're saying,
Emergency
I'm not aware that in an apartment building in town, that if Seton Hall buys it, that they would police it with their own police. I don't think that happens, does it?
That I don't
Doubt
know.
it. You don't know?
I have no idea.
But would they have jurisdiction? And
Oh,
would they
yeah.
be responsible for any kind of breaches that might occur?
They would have jurisdiction even if it was anywhere. The police don't give up jurisdiction.
Yeah. You mean the South Orange Police would still have jurisdiction? Yeah. But I
But to
don't,
Mr. Pollock, go ahead.
I don't know, Bob, of what the relationship is in that.
I think we could use some clarification of many of these related issues.
Well, so I mean, specifically what I'm suggesting is that in the letter, we raise this as something that came up during a case, and that, you know, my opinion would be that the letters say that we believe the zoning should be, that we should specifically call out dormitory uses off campus as dormitories, and put some specifics around when that's appropriate, when it's not, or how that gets
Well,
reviewed.
what would be your ideas of how,
That it's a use variance.
and what would be the conditions of, you know?
Well, I mean, to my mind, it's a it's a use change that therefore would get the same review in terms of positive and negative impact, right? The positive impact, I would assume, would be it's a university and that's a, you know, that's a given, but then we'd have to review the negative impact on the community.
Is that ever been established as a legal decision, Mr. Dwyer?
Not that I'm aware of. There are a couple of university use variance cases which are fairly prominent. But to Mr. Palapiano's point, and I recall back when 1 Center Street was before the board, an objector got up and said that these properties acquired by the university have been de facto rezoned.
That's right, that's right. And they've been use rezoned.
Right.
Right? And so we review, when they buy a private house and want to convert it into an office, we review that, right? And we
Yes.
consider it in terms of the impact on the zone. What I'm saying is the apartments, frankly, have potentially much more impact when they're converted to dormitories, and yet they don't get reviewed as a use variance, right? And I think they should be. So-
Is there a consensus on the board that this is something that?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't know the history. When they've purchased an apartment building in town, have they converted the apartments? Have they taken the kitchens out? Or do they rent the apartments to students who become the apartment dwellers in the building?
I think that was their argument on Valley, that they were individual units, they still had their own kitchens. So they were still, even though occupied by students, they said they're still apartments.
Right, but
Because
they're.
really,
but-
other than the fact that it's Seton Hall's ownership rather than a private landlord, young kids share apartments all the time, everywhere. So the fact that you're having unrelated kids renting apartments, why is that any different? I don't actually get it.
Well, how would it be different? I imagine I know what your
Well, I
answer
guess-
would be, but
Yeah, how would it be different? Concentration, single-purpose use, right? The fact that they all come in September and leave in June, the use in the summer, I don't, there would be some visible differences, but I think the big difference is the impact on the community. I think if you load a building with, 4 undergraduates per apartment times 20 apartments, and there's 80 18 to 20-year-olds living in one building, I think it does have an impact. on it.
you're suggesting that there would be a greater density of students in those number of apartments.
Yeah, you would think, that's right. So one thing you would think that would be measurable would be the number of people per,
Well, that's allowed by code. I mean, it may be true, but I think that's a code issue.
Right.
Off the top of my head, just trying to guess what would be a difference, a bunch of rowdy students as opposed, young adults, as opposed to, on average, older adults.
right.
Well, but, I'm
You know.
sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but on the other hand, in my experience in town, and back when my kids were little, we used to use a lot of Seton Hall babysitters. They all lived off campus. I mean, they all lived in those apartments. I mean, really,
Right.
all I'm seeing in terms of being a difference is the landlord. All those apartment buildings on that side of town are entirely rented, or not
Largely-
entirely, but
largely rented.
mostly rented by students from Seton Hall.
Right.
I mean, used to be my babysitters.
We have any other thoughts on that?
It'd be interesting if anybody knew or could reach out and get some information about how it's handled in New Brunswick, where Rutgers is all over New Brunswick.
Your mic, you need your mic. You need to use the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Be interesting to know how it's handled in New Brunswick, where Rutgers is all over town. My grandson just graduated from Rutgers about a year ago, and he lived off campus, and so many people live off campus. Some of the buildings are owned by Rutgers, some of them are fraternity houses.
yeah.
Some
Well,
of them
actually,
are private boarding houses, and, it's a big mixture.
I mean, I'd go back to, actually, these are good questions, and I haven't thought this fully through. But it's interesting if the building code recognizes it as different. That says that the people who wrote the building code and the state government believe there is a difference in the use or something that requires a difference in the way the building is built, managed, and maintained.
I think the difference, though, in the building code issue versus, a dormitory versus an apartment is, as Mr. Breen said, there's still kitchens in these apartments. They're still treated as single units. It's just a matter of the owner of the property is renting them to students, and the owner of the property happens to be the university. Doesn't really make it a dormitory
Yeah, I
at that,
think,
at that point.
I think if there was ever an application where they bought an apartment building and they were removing all the kitchens.
Right.
And basically increasing the density of the units.
They no longer become single units.
Right.
It becomes basically a bunch of bedrooms or, you know, and.
Why?
They
Yeah,
would
I
be-
mean,
they would
another
become
question.
How the
eating
UCC
space.
distinguishes?
I have to look at what the difference is. I just know they're in different use categories.
Right.
Because
We
a
should look at it.
dormitory, while it's a permanent situation, is still a transient occupancy, because you're not
Right,
there,
right.
you know, potentially you're not there forever. So,
Hopefully.
Does anyone know how the zoning applies to fraternity houses, which might house 20 or 30 students?
Oh, that's a whole other, that's a whole other mishmash. That's
Be like a
that's
boarding
mess.
house, wouldn't it?
Yes. And to Mr. Shapiro's point, that Rutgers State universities are treated separately because of their exception
Yeah.
from zoning.
I mean, it's an interesting question about, given that, as you said, and I think it's my observation as well, that many of the apartment buildings in town are renting to students, why Seton Hall feels the need to buy a building to rent to students. If the need's being met by the private market, why are they buying? And what change is it? What does the change in ownership mean? What is the
It's a
difference?
business
there?
arrangement for them.
Right, I think the only
It's
reason
their
would be for
business.
their, good for them.
They make money.
Yeah.
Well, or they serve their students better.
Yeah.
They don't
Yeah,
have enough.
my
on-campus.
guess, I mean, is it's, you know, they can have quality control.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you know, that they can renovate those apartments. I mean, some of those apartments can be, you know, and they have been rented to young kids for years and years and years.
Yeah.
Some of them could be, you know, run down. I mean, I don't know what their reasoning is, but I mean, I can see a
Right.
university which wants to attract students and wants to be able to claim, you know, it's always been a commuter school, and they want to be able to claim that they've got the ability to house everybody, that they want quality housing. And the way to get it
Well, so let me-
is to control it.
You know, I guess the other, this is going to, I'll just throw this out there. This is not a discussion really for the annual letter, but I think the other question it raises is the question, Bob, I think that you were getting at, which is when they buy a building, does it become part of the university zone? The answer is no, but de facto it does. And so when it becomes, it's an increasing of the university's presence. And, you know, we've had all this testimony that the goal of the university is to contain the activity of the university on their site. That was testimony of the university in the cases we heard.
except when they don't.
Except when they don't, right? And you know, part of what I'm looking for here is a way to, we have the ability to review cases where they're converting a single-family house into an office because it's a use change. I'm looking for a way to force a review on the impact on the community when they take over a building and make it part of the university.
Would it be fair to say that it's not the specific example that you're giving necessarily that you want to focus on? It's more the expansion of the university into the
But
community.
again, as I said, I think where they expand by looking for by converting office space, we have, in most cases, that's required a use variance, and therefore it comes to the board for review. These cases don't, right? And yet it could wind up being a lot of real estate. So, we have time, obviously, you're drafting a letter. I'd be interested to look at the question about the building code and when it applies, and maybe I'll do some investigation about other towns, and, you know, if there's anything that I can find online about that.
I think, you need to sell it to the board. If we're going to put it in the letter as a
I understand.
recommendation, there needs to be a consensus.
I understand that.
There was also another question on that same application where there was a debate. You disagreed with their attorney. There was wording in the law, what was it, about apartment?
On the first floor.
Substantial modification or,
First floor use. whether or
First
not
floor,
qualified
first
as-
floor use,
Whether or not it's qualified as an apartment building, wasn't that the question?
right.
Sal?
It was a question of the first floor. You said that
In the ordinance
In a
definition.
particular zone.
in the business zone, that first floor could not be
Correct.
apartment.
Right.
And they were saying, well, it's an apartment building, so therefore you could have the first floor.
Well, that section of the zoning is it's charitably ambiguously worded.
And you were adamant that,
The intent
No.
of the ordinance is, and my
No.
interpretation, is that the use of apartments in the B2 zone is permitted on above a
Above.
first floor. So it's either office space or
Right.
retail space.
But this was a building that was already an
And
apartment
this was a
building.
building that was, I believe, granted a variance to be an apartment building way back.
This is an apartment building, it was purely an apartment building.
Correct.
Why do we
Built-
allow them to
yeah.
buy so much?
So it was by ownership by Seton Hall, did that make it a business use? Is that what the
And then there was
issue
the
was?
separate
it's still
issue
an
of
apartment
the
building.
substantial what was a substantial
That was the one I
modification.
thought you were going after, right,
Well,
yeah.
I think, so then maybe we could ask for clarification about the B2 zone, that the apartments permitted above the first floor, which is what our zoning engineer maintains, is.
Right, it should just say that.
Yeah.
Now, what's about the substantial
Well,
modification?
they wanted to remove a deck and basically close off a door on the second floor. And they said that they were reducing the scope of the building, which previously had gotten a variance, and therefore they didn't need a new variance in order to do that. At least that's the way I remember it.
Right, and
That's
the
the-
ordinance
that-
had some wiggle room in it, and the board drove through it.
Right,
I like the wiggle room.
right.
Yeah, I don't mind the word substantial. I don't think I think it leaves it up to us to judge in this case
Right.
what is substantial. I wouldn't want to try to nail that down.
And given my experience with the Board of Trustees, given all that they have on their plate, to get them into these niggling little questions of what's defined substantial, I don't think they're going to do it,
5% of
Right.
floor area.
I just, I think they've
Right.
got bigger, I think we should
Our job.
focus on
Right,
a bigger question.
right.
And I like that wiggle room. And
Yeah, me
because
too.
I think we used it wisely in this case.
The other thing that might be interesting, that obviously it's going to be in that letter, is the issue of, a large lot in the Montrose section, and whether you can carve out something that used to be a lot there in order to sell it off as a new building lot.
Well, and also just the whole relationship between the HPC
Right.
and us.
Well, that, to me, that would be
Yeah.
the heart of the letter.
That would be
Yeah.
it, yeah.
They're working on that. I did go to a planning and zoning committee meeting to let them know about this issue, and they acknowledged
Oh, good,
that ordinance needs some reworking,
yeah.
and I can put that in the letter.
And one of the things I would
My-
like
My
is,
understanding was they were drafting the historic preservation element to the master plan. We're about to authorize
Oh.
that to be drafted, so we'll help clarify the issue.
yeah, but that's this question of significant and the nature of the properties. There's a process problem here, right? We have tried, I think, to come up with what we believe the process should be of when a case comes in, when it goes there, when it comes back. And they need to lay out, I think, the flow, right, the workflow among the various committees. Because I think right now it's not clear, and it must be very confusing to applicants of who they're going to when, for what, and what case, what they're presenting. I mean, to me, I can't figure it out.
Well, and added to that is that sometimes the HPC is advisory, and sometimes it
That's
actually
right.
has jurisdiction.
That's right, that's right.
So I think hopefully that'll get clarified in some of the master plan stuff, but
But I
it would
think
be, it would be good if there was a real roadmap
That's
that
right,
we
even
could
for an
follow.
applicant, it should say, this is how you apply, right?
Right.
This is where you go first, second, third, and, and I think one of the things that would happen if you laid that roadmap out is you'd look at it and say, what a torturous path we've laid out, right? And look how much time and expense we've added to the applicant process, for what?
I agree. I think the HPC ordinance needs work. I know that some people find it really problematic, but I can see there are benefits to it, especially in an area such as Montrose where you're trying to protect, and I think it should do more to protect actually the facades of those beautiful homes.
Mhm.
It's part of the reason people invest there, and it's good for the town as well. And I understand they have limited jurisdiction for design, but perhaps that's something that they can write rules about.
Well, it's certainly the element of what constitutes a contributing versus key contributing. Is there a difference between that? That's becoming, the matter of litigation now.
That's the key. That's got to be straightened out.
And so that will be straightened out, just per force of the litigation that's being involved, one way or the other. And that's probably the primary thing. There are other elements to it too. So in speaking with the Planning and Zoning Committee, the members of the HPC did acknowledge that it needs work, and that the Planning and Zoning Committee also recognized that it needed work also. if you have any other, going back after this meeting, if you have other specific elements of the HPC that you would suggest changed, send them to me in an email. I would put them in a draft, send them out to everybody. Obviously, I'm going to address the issue of contributing versus key contributing. I'm convinced that's going to be clarified.
Yeah, to me, even once you have that clarified, though, there's a process question.
Yes.
And it's also interesting, Mr. Chairman, that we don't anywhere in town allow wireless telecommunication
Right.
installations, but whether or not towns do, the state and the federal government are making it very easier for them and much more difficult for municipalities to eliminate that use. And we have a couple of places in town which have become the places where applicants go. There's 76 South Orange Avenue, there's a place on Valley, there's the water tower in Newstead. None of them are allowed,
Right.
allowable uses, but the federal government has pretty much weighed in on that and said, we're going to allow those.
Right.
Is
One of
there a
these
particular
things.
angle that we could
Get our
take
hands
with
tied.
a local ordinance that might modify?
Well,
I
the
think there's
permitted use.
a huge preemption issue, even if we try to, I think what's happening, as I see the regulation, there's another article in the Planner, there's a clarification of a former federal statute, which is making it easier for co-location especially, and they're promoting it and making it more difficult for boards to say no. But I think in the long run, that's probably a good thing, because everyone has a cell phone, they all want it to work. So I'm not sure, even if we tried to come up with those areas where we thought it was a good idea for that use to exist, that would prevent what's already happened, which is there are those areas which right now, where it exists, and co-location is going to be favored in those areas.
Right.
And to avoid, someone having to put up a brand-new 100-foot tower, let them go where everyone is already there.
Well, right. And I think that's why why we haven't had any, as far as I'm aware of, any pushback, either from the Board of Trustees or, for that matter, from residents of the town complaining about the several antenna that we have allowed on the bank building in town, because it's worked. Right.
This is an area where our engineering consultants could help effectively draw a map. I mean, it's almost like a zoning map overlay that says here are areas where, we could do something with this, is areas where antennas are permitted based on where, the height of buildings or the height of the land would make them valuable, and just make a permitted area, make a permitted zone.
That would also then it would assume that would be a logical place to put an antenna based upon spotty coverage.
Right.
So that place where we might want it to be may not
Right. be
appropriate place for reception.
Yeah. But then, of course, then you have a variance, right?
That's where our engineer expert comes in.
Right. You're not going
No, from
to
Amlin.
completely eliminate the need for variance hearings, but to put one more antenna on a place where there's already 10 shouldn't be a whole hearing.
And that's what the feds are trying to do.
Yeah.
You think the Board of Trustees has any appetite for this? Yeah.
I wouldn't.
Because,
Can't speak for them,
Because
but
Yeah.
it works. Because what we do now works.
Maybe on a university zone property.
you got to keep in mind, though, I mean, depending on where they need the tower, it's not just typically the elevation, because if they needed a tower closer to, say, the southern border of the village, but not in the Wyoming area, then they could look at an area along Valley Street and put a tower up somewhere along those properties on Valley Street if they needed to somehow reach in that direction. I mean, and in which case they still would have to come to the board unless you allowed it anywhere in town. So I think, as Patrick was saying,
well, I mean,
the federal government's
first of all, I don't
running this right
I
now.
don't. Our question is not whether the board has an appetite or has any interest. Our question is whether it's a good thing to recommend that they make a change to the zoning. And I mean, one possibility is to recommend that cell antennas be a permitted accessory use of an existing building, period. And, I mean, within certain conditions, that could be, right?
Well, so right now, I'm just trying to work through the logic, right? So right now, we don't allow cell towers anywhere.
Right, every time they have one, it's a variance
Right.
application.
And so by allowing cell towers in key situations, we think that we might be able to avoid an applicant coming for a variance in a place that they're not allowed, even though they can do it wherever they're not allowed now.
I wouldn't say they
I
can do it wherever they're not allowed. By not having a ordinance that allows certain places, it gives us theoretically
The right to
greater
review.
greater discretion to say no.
Right.
Although, we've always ultimately said yes, because we
That's right.
recognize the utility of these, but
But, if you made an accessory use, other restrictions in the zone would still apply. Height restrictions, bulk, general bulk restrictions would still apply.
And they would still be required to at least get a site plan approval.
That's right, that's
Planning
right,
board.
that's right. It wouldn't,
Still
it would
be
just mean,
an application
there's a lot
process.
about these, adding one more, if they didn't want to extend the height of the building up, I think they would have still required a variance.
I like the co-location, though.
Yeah.
I like it. Instead of having antennas
Absolutely.
everywhere, it's one blot on one particular building, and you're going to find them on water towers everywhere.
Yeah. So it could be it could potentially be, but we would need, obviously, engineering and planning guidance on this, but it could be something as simple as saying it's an approved accessory use on buildings in town, subject to the rest of the restrictions of the zone, of this particular zone.
On commercial buildings?
You could say that. You could say it's only on commercial buildings, right? But it could be a rather blanket that just takes that hurdle out of the way, but maybe leaves the bulk
Well,
restriction.
I think if you do that, you're going to see antenna on every building, every which way,
And the village will have less
all over the place.
Be careful
control
what you
over it,
wish
whereas
for.
by forcing them to come to this board, there is the opportunity for this board to say, okay, wait a second, that's too much, or that's too high, or that's.
No,
whereas
height restrictions still apply.
If it's put into the code and areas are identified that it can be put in, as long as they meet the code, then there's, then how are you going to limit the restrictions? Every cell carrier, every new cell phone, and there's new ones popping up constantly, are going to be looking to do this, so.
Do you believe that there are cell companies out there that have wanted to put towers, antenna in South Orange and have not put it because?
No.
No.
Because they all know that if they do go to the board,
They're going to get approval.
they have so much behind them in terms of federal and state.
Right, but it
authority
is,
that they-
and that's why I'm saying it's the only opportunity for the town to be able to have some control over it. In the end, if they don't agree to any conditions that the board may place on the application, they can then go and fight it and most likely will win in court. But at least that's your first line of defense to say, wait a second. you
Yeah, but
already
the
have-
bulk restrictions of the zone could still apply, meaning if they wanted to go up higher, if they chose a low building and wanted to put a mast on top, they'd still have to come here, right? And then we would say to them, why don't you go to a taller building and put them wherever else is?
How do you limit them?
I'm sorry?
How do you limit? Where do you put the limit? Where do you put the?
Well, the limit would be the bulk limits on the zone itself. Right, now, if what you're saying is somebody would plaster flat antenna on the facade of every low building downtown, I don't know. Really?
Well, that's what you're
Why would-
suggesting,
Why would they?
If you're allowing it on every building along Valley Street, obviously, they're going to choose the higher
If
building.
someone came to us today and said, I want to put an antenna on a low building because there's this one dead spot for a really important customer, and that's the only place I can put an antenna to cover that spot, everything else, what would we say? I think we would approve it, given the force of, maybe we'd say, can you make it a little nicer? I don't know what, but we'd approve it.
Yeah, I've read, unfortunately, had to read a lot of zoning ordinances in my day, and a lot of them have sections applying to cell towers, but I haven't come across any that have them as a permitted use. There are towns, Teaneck and up in Bergen County that have design standards So just for that reason, if you end up putting it on the face of a 4-story apartment building instead of up on the roof, that it has to blend the color has to blend architecturally. But none of them have them as a permitted use. So it's still a variance application, but they sort of give them almost like a design guideline, that if it's on this kind of building.
If you meet this, you're
Right.
likely to get approved.
I have to say, it's pretty weird.
What's that?
Have a design guideline
For
for
something
something that you
that's not
don't
Right.
allow.
Well, I think it recognizes that they're going to get an approval.
Yeah, and I think what it does, it'll discourage, I mean, if there isn't some way to control it, who's to stop a carrier to buy the property right behind your house, take down the house, and build a tower? Yes, it meets the code requirements and whatever, but now you've got a tower in your backyard. And it's by ordinance permitted, because it's, in the zone, I'm just, as an example.
So it's not in residential zones. What's the next objection?
Towers go into even residential zones that totally break the height requirements of towns, and the zoning boards can't do anything about those either. I've seen it happen in numerous occasions, unless the laws have become stricter with regard to that.
To some extent, we're lucky because of the geography of the town, that with the valley that we're in,
Yes.
you can reach pretty much the whole town without having to go up very high, because you have height around us, right?
You put one in your backyard.
Great idea.
You live in Newstead?
Yes,
Right on the edge there?
yes.
Perfect.
Well, do we have a consent?
Police and what?
Mr. Parlapiano is proposing making it a permitted use. Do we have a consensus for that? I'm not for it at this point, but do we have a consensus that,
I'm ambivalent about it. I mean, like I said, it's really hard for me to grasp the logic. I don't see that there's going to be a difference in the way that an applicant's going to make a decision.
Right, they
I
make the
think the one
decisions,
advantage is that we get to see them all now.
they make the decision on what works for them.
Right.
As painful as they are sometimes, I think at least it gives us, last application, I think, we pushed them to a point where they actually had to think a little bit, and they came back with a solution.
And we
that-
pushed them over a height restriction.
Right, right.
Which could still apply.
Right,
Would
and
still
I think, the question is, if they would have dug in their heels and said, no, we really want to do it this way, and it went to litigation, would they have?
No, if they had said, we cannot get the coverage needed by our subscribers at that height.
Right.
And therefore, we must go higher.
Right.
I think in that case, we would have a tough time in litigation.
Right. Which is
And
why,
that's where-
I don't think it has to be changed, because I think that the way that the states and the federal governments are regulating the industry, that they are making it easier already, and this board has the authority to hear it, because it's a use variance, but to some extent, the board's hands are already tied and will continue to be tied by those other
So
bounds.
I think my point here is, if our hands are tied already, if our real concern is bulk, and maybe a little, lay the ground rules out in the zoning, to put some boundaries around it, but recognize the reality, and rather than making people jump through hoops for no purpose.
Well, I don't agree. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, they know they're going to get the variance, we know they're going to get the variance. But I think, and again, I was not part of the singular discussion, but it seems to me that if they have to come before this board, if the board has certain objections, they're going to want to work with the board as well. I mean, whether they, meet whether they could win it in litigation. I'm a litigator. Nobody wants to go to litigation. You go to litigation, everybody loses. It costs huge amounts of money and could take years. Nobody wants to do that. So the reality is, by leaving it alone the way it is now, even though it's somewhat of a toothless thing, you have enough teeth that, again, it sounds like with regard to singular, you negotiated an acceptable option, when in fact, if they wanted to dig in, they could have. And that's why I'd leave it alone.
And you're right, because if we had dug in, as he said, it would cost Singular a lot of money. So they were willing to work with us.
they didn't think of the obvious. We were like, well, can you just put them on a different location? Okay, we'll have it your way. That's basically what it came, they didn't think about it. We thought a simple solution for them, because it wasn't permitted. We did have that advantage, and they worked with us because it was simple. They knew as soon as we suggested it, like, oh geez,
Right, should have thought of that.
Yes, exactly.
What I'm proposing is a permitted use, but still subject to bulk requirements of the zone. They still would have had to come to us, even at the current height, because it's already a variance, it's already above the permitted height in the zone. That case would have still been here. And frankly, if they can find a place, maybe on the water tower, where you can put one that doesn't in any way violate the zoning of that location, let them. That's all. It's not, there aren't that many of these. It just seems to me, it's the time when I sit on the board and I feel like I'm part of a bad bureaucratic machine, kind of going through the process, making people spend money on professionals and hours of their time, when in fact it's a foregone conclusion where we're going to go. And I don't like that feeling, so.
Well, it's not only in this town, probably in many other towns it's the same. They're accustomed to it.
I'm not saying they're not.
You haven't worked in state government, have you, Mr.
I have not worked in
Palapiano?
state government.
Well, I invite you to work with me.
Well, I invite you to help chip away at that.
Trying to build the bricks in the wall. I understand your point, Mike. I don't think we need to, look, if this board had a consensus, then I'll write it in the letter. Does the board have a consensus? I don't see it yet. If you want to persuade the board.
I will work on persuading the board.
Okay. We have anything else to put in the letter? Okay, and in the ensuing days, because I am going to be writing it in the next week or so, if you have other ideas, let me know. I'll come up with the draft, I'll send it out to y'all, you send it back to me with your ideas, and then I'll incorporate those and send it out again. And then we'll get it to the Board of Trustees. Again, my experience in presenting it to the Board of Trustees, they have occasionally addressed some of the bigger issues that we've.
Trying to remember one.
No, I think didn't they address the 10% lot coverage deal with a deck? I think they did. They made it clear that it was
Get the additional 10%.
the additional 10%. What was it? They addressed
Permitted
it.
if there's a dry well, something to that effect.
And if they have a non-conforming lot, right?
You're allowed to exceed the allowable lot coverage by 10% of what's permitted if you install a dry well system in order to
Mitigate.
mitigate the additional runoff.
Did they change that code?
That was
Yeah,
done,
that's,
that was done a few years ago.
Yep.
Yeah. Actually, more than that.
I'll call you back, I'm in a meeting.
So anyways, they
I'll call you
would
back in a
occasionally
minute.
address a bigger issue. That's my point.
Call
All
you
right.
back, I'm in a meeting.
Anything else? So when's our next meeting, Jetta?
February 3rd.
February 3rd?
Yes, February 3rd.
February 3rd at 7 PM. Is that here in SOPAC?
Yes.
Okay, so that's where the meeting is.
Do we have any case on the agenda at this point?
Not right now.
I guess at best, we would have completeness reviews.
Empty deck.
Right. Okay, all right.
I'd like to raise a question, and I don't know whether it's a question that's appropriate for on the record or off the record. So I'll just give you the general heading. It's something that's troubled me, and I don't know if anybody else on the board is troubled by this at all. But I was troubled by the fact that when Seton Hall recognized, going back to the Mary Lawn issue, recognized that the cost of restoring Graves House was prohibitive, and that was a condition upon which they had to do that in order to move forward with taking over and operating Mary Lawn. They dropped it like a hot potato because it was just a prohibitive cost. And I was concerned because I can't imagine anybody else being willing to come in and restore that property and make it into a school or something else. It's just going to sit there and sit there and sit there. And I don't know how the board feels about whether or not there could be an uncoupling of that condition and whether or not it would hurt anybody if, since the Graves house is falling apart, if the thing were permitted to be demolished, so that they could go ahead and.
Well, ultimately, the demolition is not our issue. That's the HPC's issue.
No, but I mean, how would the board react if they came back to it and said, can we uncouple?
You're talking about a subdivision.
Pardon me?
I think you're talking about a subdivision.
Well, I think he just means,
Is that what it would be, a subdivision? Okay.
no, I think what Bob means is an uncoupling of
Coupling the condition.
the condition that you have to restore
Well,
the
that
Graves
would,
house.
that would in fact uncouple the condition.
I think we have to see how it plays out. I mean, we can't force anybody to do anything.
That was the
I know
HPC's
that.
condition, it wasn't ours.
Am I the only one who was troubled by the fact that they just withdrew the application and that may be sitting there for another 10 years?
No, I'm not troubled by it. I think the Planning and Zoning Committee is working on this issue right now. And they could decide to, decide to rezone it, to make it possible that the university could move in if they wanted to. They could possibly not change it.
Zone it for cell towers?
They could zone it for whatever they wanted. So the Planning and Zoning Committee understands this is one of the few big developable lots in town. They understand that a major player in town walked away from something. They understand what this property could mean. You know, you're talking about a hypothetical for a board that
I know.
we didn't have to address.
I don't even remember, did they actually own the property, or was it a conditional sale?
No, they didn't own
Conditional
it.
They
sale.
didn't own it.
They were subject to getting an approval.
That's what I thought.
Right.
So who does own it?
The sisters.
Sisters of Charity.
Pardon me?
Sisters of Charity.
Oh, that's still a viable entity?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
The, you know, we as board members are not allowed to participate on that zoning committee. You know, you're not allowed to hold those dual types of roles in the town. But I do know that I testified at the results of what we saw in our hearing, and, you know, then I haven't come back, and I just know that they are working on it. So we'll see what comes of it.
So we may see Seton Hall back?
I don't know.
Right.
Don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, with that, I'm going to close the meeting. Have a good evening.